Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm going to be talking about the new album from Drake. Views. Drake is a rapper from Toronto, who I could not possibly give less of a crap about. I think he's boring. Why don't we talk about some actual interesting music, like Brian Eno? That's better. Why don't we talk about his new album, The Ship? Well, Brian Eno is a legendary British producer, best known for having been one of the pioneers of the genre known as ambient music. In fact, I believe it was him who came up with that term. And yes, while ambient is one of the most stereotypically boring genres in existence, and I suppose one could make the argument that Eno is also boring, I have to wholeheartedly disagree with that. Unlike other electronic pioneers that are kinda stuck in their time, for instance, Kraftwerk, who haven't released a new album since 2003, and who I would personally prefer never release another album again, actually, Eno's been keeping it up on a pretty steady run of keeping his sound fresh over the decades. He's got a lot of albums, many of which are collaborations, and since this is already going to be a really long and brief segment, I'll just go down all the albums I already have on my iPod, which is 22 albums, so let's not waste any more time with a prelude. Here's my thoughts on a good portion of his discography so far. This is kind of a David Bowie-inspired glam rock art pop album, at least I assume so, since Eno's Twitter talks about Bowie like every other day. And honestly, I'm not a huge fan, but this one is also cut from the same cloth, and I enjoyed it significantly more, so what have you. Also, this is my favorite Eno album of all time. Some catchy Bowie-ish rock tunes and some quiet instrumental sections, and not a single forgettable track. This is probably his first real ambient album. First side is mostly like one big half-hour electronic pad, and the second side is a couple of violin pieces. Collaboration with Robert Fripp of King Crimson, and 4 happier and more tranquil pieces on the first side, and the second side is an index of metals, which is really slow, but still interesting to say the least. Another pretty fun art pop album, about the same level as Taking Tiger Mountain quality-wise, I think. Pretty legendary album right here. I don't know if it's one of my personal favorites, but it is certainly a must-listen. Well, what it says on the tin. 18 short ambient compositions that wouldn't sound out of place on a film soundtrack. Pretty cool. This is a collaboration with pianist Harold Budd. I think this might be my favorite of the ambient series, but I'm still deciding. This is a collaboration with zither player Laraji, and also easily my least favorite of the ambient series, but still pretty cool. The most electronic of the ambient series, and it is between this and Plateau of Mirror for my favorite volume. Still deciding. Another pretty legendary ambient electronic album, and a must-listen for sure. Yep, 21 more short ambient pieces picking up where music for films left off. Another Harold Budd collaboration, and it's cool, but not better than Plateau of Mirror, in my opinion. This is 1 hour-long, smooth ambient piece, and honestly, it's also probably my least favorite Eno record to date, because I don't really always have the patience for it, but it's perfectly fine if I happen to be in the right mood. This is a really interesting one, and not even particularly ambient, mixing experimental electronic with jazz, and definitely worth checking out. Another more ambient release, although this one is much darker and more electronic than the usual. This is another near hour-long piece, and like Thursday Afternoon, I don't usually have the patience to hear it all the way through, but I think this one is slightly better. This is another weird one, kinda like Nerve Net, but more ambient. A lot of it feels like it could have come from some mystery movie soundtrack or something. This is Eno's first album with his own vocals since Before or After Science, and while again it's no Another Green World, it's certainly pretty decent in its own right. This is a collaboration with John Hopkins, and that is just as awesome as it sounds like. They don't even just stick to ambient stuff either. There's some pretty intense tracks on here too. Go check it out. Not gonna lie, I wasn't really feeling this one. The 4 pieces are really thematically similar, and while the instrumentation is easily more interesting than Thursday Afternoon, I don't know, I found it to be a little disappointing. Which brings us to this album. So technically, it's been 4 years since the last solo Eno album, and though there's been a couple of projects within that gap, so the guy really never left in the first place. Now, I wasn't hugely impressed by Eno's last two solo albums, Another Day on Earth and Lux, which I felt were trying to replicate the success of earlier records and coming up kinda short. But I was still optimistic for this one, since A, we have 2 long extended ambient pieces on this one, and B, I heard that Eno once again directly sings on this one. That already is something Eno has not done before on the same album, so I at least knew for sure I wasn't going to get a rehashed experience. The question is, how does it turn out? Well, believe it or not, even better than I expected. Like I said before, just the combination of ambient Eno with vocal Eno guaranteed a fresh experience, but it's much more well executed than either of the last 2 albums, which had the experiences separated. One thing that kind of sets this album apart from his usual stuff is how weirdly dark, serious, and somber it is. Not really in the creepy Shutov assembly manner. Well, yes, it is exceptionally creepy for the vast majority, but Shutov Assembly was much more minimalistic and inhuman. There is certainly a human element to this album that isn't present there. The album subject matter, from what I can understand, is mainly the sinking of the Titanic in World War I, so that should give you an idea of the kind of atmosphere Eno brings to the table here. Let's talk about the title track first, and get ready, there's surprisingly a lot to unpack. At least by Eno standards. The title track, I believe, is the one about the Titanic, and I think it's less about it sinking and more about what it was like after it sunk. It starts out simple with some straightforward synth pads, but then I think we get a live orchestra coming in, and then it evolves for a bit, changing around, and then a little before the 6-minute mark, Eno starts singing and setting the scene. His singing is unsurprisingly really slow, and there's some kind of odd filter on it. As he keeps singing, the ambient stuff keeps changing and evolving. I keep hearing some kind of weird synth bells that sound like a satellite beeping or something, or maybe a radar beeping. And about 15 minutes in, there's no more Eno singing, and we get some odd female voice, and later some other voice samples, chopped up and glitched up. It all creates a weirdly haunting atmosphere that slowly gets increasingly foreboding. And if this track wasn't strange enough for Eno, then we get Fickle Part 1. There was so much going on over the course of this track's 18-minute running time that I can't even begin to explain it in a logical order. Eno sings here again, this time I think more about World War I, but everything in general feels more atonal and convoluted. We have Neroli-style blips at the beginning. We also have synth basses and orchestral sounds, distorted guitars, horn sections, various different electronic noises that sound like something out of an old Tangerine Dream album, organs, voice samples, vocoders, what have you. But the coolest part is about 7.5 minutes in, when there's suddenly this huge orchestra making these huge epic horn blares. And the overall atmosphere of the song as a whole ends up actually not being that far from the title track, just stranger and more disorganized. Not saying that's a bad thing, by the way, I thought that was a really awesome track. But after all this weirdness, we move on to the short spoken word poem of Fickle Part 2, The Hour is Thin, and finally Fickle Part 3, I'm Set Free, which is just a straight cover of a song by the Velvet Underground. Eno actually does a pretty good job of making the song his own, like one of the vocal tracks from Another Green World, and ends the album on a fairly positive and warm note. I mean, I'm not really a Velvet Underground fan, but I did actually really like this song too. So, there was a lot more to this album than I expected. If you're one of those people who thinks Eno is boring, maybe you could stand to give this album a try. It's constantly changing and going all over the place in a much more drastic fashion than I'm used to from Eno, and overall I was really impressed by this album in a way that I didn't see coming at all. Eno fans are in for a real treat with this, and the darker undertones and surprising amount of content make for a welcome change of pace. I was starting to get scared that Eno was starting to make albums for the sake of nostalgia trips, but now I know better, and it's great to see that even in 2016, over 40 years into his career, that he can still bring something new and fresh to the table. You really have to admire the guy for this. This album was awesome. I'm overall feeling an 8.5 out of 10. Favorite tracks, The Ship and Fickle Part 1. Least favorite track, Fickle Sun Part 2, The Hour is Thin. But of course, this is just my opinion, you can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. But yeah, that is pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.